Good evening and welcome to Primetime Lawmakers for March 3rd, 2011, the 23rd legislative day of the 2011 session of the Georgia General Assembly. I'm Scott Slade. Coming up in tonight's program, small businesses may have to comply with the federally Verify program as the House passes a controversial illegal immigration bill. Parents, hold on to those booster seats. The Senate approves a measure changing age and height requirements for child restraints in cars. We continue our leadership interview series tonight. Senate Majority Leader Chip Rogers addresses the passage of that immigration bill and more. And taxes, they're hard to get away from. But Georgia is considering sweeping revisions to its tax code. I'll talk with Representative Mickey Chanel, sponsor of the tax overhaul bill, and Kelly McCutcheon, president of the Georgia Public Policy Foundation, an independent think tank. We'll get the details on that really matter. All that is coming up tonight on Primetime Lawmakers. But first, the House passes its version of immigration reform after hours of debate on both sides of the issue. Nwandi Lawson's been following the accident on House Bill 87. She is live at the Capitol. Good evening, Nwandi.
Good evening, Scott. The measure was slated today for 3 hours of debate, and those on both sides of the issue set out to use that time. Disagreements about whether the measure penalizes businesses by requiring them to verify the immigration status of employees, if a provision allowing citizens to sue local governments for hiring undocumented workers would lead to frivolous lawsuits, or whether churches and other groups that work with refugees might be accused of harboring illegal immigrants. Representative Matt Ramsey, who sponsors HB 87, acknowledges that the state cannot police the national borders, but he says Georgia can protect its own borders from illegal immigration.
What we can do within the bounds of the U.S. and the Georgia Constitution and within our existing laws is we can remove every single incentive that we possibly can that lures illegal aliens to come to Georgia, individuals that come into our country illegally and make the decision to come here. The incentives that our taxpayers are footing the bill for, we can remove those as state policymakers, and that's exactly what House Bill 87 proposes to do.
The Southeast's first Korean state legislator argued in favor of HB 87, saying it does not encourage racial profiling.
I implore you to just read the bill. It provides clear guidance on the police officers and law enforcement exactly when they can investigate the status of the person and exactly when they cannot. They also claim that it will discourage immigrants from reporting crimes when they're victims or witnesses. The bill, once again, specifically addresses this. It says when they're calling as victim or witnesses, the police cannot investigate the immigration status of the person calling. How much more clear can we get?
In the hallway, HB 87 supporters watched the debate, while Representative Katie Dempsey argued illegal immigration costs the state's education system.
Today, in our classrooms all across our state, 175,000 students, nearly 10% of our K through 12 students are illegal aliens or are children of an illegal alien. What that means is that $1 billion of our state QBE money is going toward those children.
Now, while the state continued its debate into the afternoon, groups opposing the immigration reform measure gathered on the steps of the Capitol. They characterized that bill as an affront to civil rights and called on Governor Nathan Deal to veto the measure.
If they pass this legislation, Rosa Parks never got up from her seat. If they pass this legislation, Emmett Till died in vain. If they pass this legislation, the March on Washington had no effect. If they pass this legislation, the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act had no effect. If they passed this legislation, if Governor Deal does not veto it, what it means is we've gone to a pre-civil rights era.
Inside the House chamber, fervent opposition to the measure. Representative Al Williams compared the bill's status check provision to slavery-era laws.
We didn't have to clear customs, as most of the times we came in illegal and were given documents where we could walk from one plantation to the other. Probable cause, you could be stopped and asked for your papers, and you had to produce them. This one is letting everybody know that Shelley here is owned by a gentleman and he has approved her moving around with this paperwork.
House Minority Leader Stacey Abrams says despite claims to the contrary, HB 87 encourages profiling.
Line 451 tells officers not to look at race or color or national origin. And lines 462 and 466, as another representative pointed out, does state that if someone has to report a crime, they will not be held responsible. Yet these mild disclaimers buried in the center of the bill ignore the 450 lines that precede it and the 250 lines that follow, the ones that give private citizens and peace officers unprecedented power to use this bill as a cause for demagoguery.
House Bill 87 did pass the House with an amendment that allows small businesses to phase in the use of the E-Verify program. That vote was 113 to 56. The bill now goes to the Senate. On the Senate side today, disagreement about whether 8-year-olds should be required to ride in booster seats if they're not at least 4 feet 9 inches tall. SB 88 did clear the Senate, but Senate President Pro Tem Tommy Williams argued that the measure makes the state overstep its boundaries.
What concerns me is we dealt with this a few years ago, and we moved it to 6 years, and we changed the height restriction, if I'm not mistaken, and now we're coming back again, adding 2 more years on it. If we keep doing this, I'm going to be in a booster seat in a couple of years.
If the kid's below that height limit and weight limit, they're not safe in a seatbelt. You might as well not put them in a seatbelt or a safety seat. You can say, oh, the kid's so big, we're going to have a hard time getting them in that seatbelt. Well, you won't have a hard time getting them in the casket because someone else will put them in the casket.
Senator Jack Murphy attempted to amend that bill to make 7 the age of booster seat cutoff. On reconsideration, that amendment failed. Senate Bill 88 passed by a vote of 38 to 13. It moves to the House, where a similar measure was adopted on Tuesday. The Senate also voted today to create the crime of medical identity theft. Senator Judson Hill sponsors SB 19.
For example, we've inserted veterans, military medical information. That's not in current law. Line 47. We've also identified it, and I believe it's important to bring this to people's attention to look at their medical records when someone's driver's license or wallet may be stolen for money, credit cards, etc. The last thing they actually think about is their health insurance card, which might be the most valuable piece of information in their wallet.
SB 19 passed the Senate by a vote of 53 to 0. It moves to the House. One day after releasing their version of a fix for the Hope Scholarship, Senate Democrats say that under Governor Deal's proposal, next year's Hope Scholarship recipients can expect close to 80% of their costs to be covered instead of the 90% that's been reported. Senator Jason Carter says that's because the governor's estimate was generated using this year's tuition rates, not next year's. Senator Carter says using an income cap would provide the savings that the governor is looking for.
Those numbers come from the savings that comes from the 6% of Georgia families, or those Hope scholars whose families make more than $140,000. They would no longer get the Hope tuition payments. They would still be eligible for the 1% low interest loan, the Zell Miller scholarship program that we've proposed, and the federal tax credits of $2,500 that are available to the federal government. But they would no longer get the Hope tuition payment, and that savings is about $130 million, the same as the governor's plan.
The Senate Higher Education continued its hearings today on HB 326. That's the Hope Scholarship legislation. Governor Deal spent the day with his friend and colleague, Newt Gingrich. The governor says that they discussed ways to limit the federal interference with state governments, but the media, of course, came to learn whether Newt Gingrich will run for president in 2012.
We've talked about issues that are of concern to him. His American Solutions organization has dealt with many important issues that are confronting us all across the spectrum. Certainly one of those is the question of the balance between the federal government and the states, specifically 10th Amendment issues. For those of us who serve at the state level, we understand that more and more we are confronted with mandates coming from Washington. Issues that have historically been the responsibility of states have now been shifted, and the burden is coming in terms of mandates from the federal level to the states.
And with the national media waiting expectantly, Gingrich described his 10th Amendment Implementation Act, but he stopped short of making the announcement everyone had come to hear.
We are today establishing a website newtexplore2012.com. And that website is up, I think, as of about an hour ago. We will look at this very seriously, and we will very methodically lay out the framework of what we'll do next. And we think that the key is to have citizens who understand this is going to take a lot of us for a long time working together.
So I guess we'll have to wait to a future press conference to find out about a Gingrich run, or maybe check that website he mentioned. Reporting live from the Capitol, I'm in Wandy Lawson for Primetime Lawmakers.
Those two magic words, exploratory committee, weren't uttered today, were they?
No, not today.
Day 23 was busy. Thanks, Wandy.
Thanks, Scott.
Continuing our leadership series, moments after the passage of illegal immigration legislation this afternoon, Iwandi sat down with Senate Majority Leader Chip Rogers. She asked him how he felt about claims that HB 87 will lead to increased racial profiling.
Sometimes when people argue against things, they just go to the lowest common denominator and use that as a tool to I guess persuade people not to support something, as opposed to actually reading the bill, going through it, finding factual evidence for or against a piece of legislation. And I know the author of the bill has challenged anyone to find in the actual legislation where there's anything that could lead to racial profiling. And to my knowledge, no one's actually found that. So, we can't make legislation based on people standing out front of the Capitol cheering one way or the other. We have to actually read the legislation, contemplate what it actually says, and either proceed forward or not. I think that the representative who worked on this bill, Matt Ramsey, put a lot of time and effort into this. I know personally that he met with just about every organization that wanted to meet with him. Certainly not all of them went away happy, but he did give them the opportunity to have input, and that's what you have to do as a good lawmaker, is let people have input. So I think he's done a good job, and he's got a good piece of legislation.
The Senate is now considering that HOPE scholarship legislation. I know you said earlier this week that once it got to the Senate side, it was going to move along with a pretty good pace, but I'm wondering, what are some of your impressions of the legislation thus far?
Well, I tell you, the work that went into this process on the HOPE scholarship was very good, and it was bipartisan, but it also included both the House and the Senate, and a lot of work in the governor's office. We've put together a very good product. I think we saw the vote, 152 votes, I believe 155 votes in the House. That is impressive. I mean, that is a bipartisan support of legislation. And we haven't really found that much wrong with it. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that pre-K is not part of this bill. And so there may be some changes to the way we look at pre-K. We're perhaps looking at a model that gives a lot more flexibility to the local communities so that they can determine for themselves what they want to do on pre-K. But for the HOPE scholarship portion that is in this particular bill, I don't think you'll see too many changes.
And then yesterday, Senate Democrats came in with their plan, which would include an income cap for the scholarship recipients, as well as their inclination to make the Zell Miller Scholarship available to 3% of all high school students here in Georgia. Is there any chance that some of those proposals might make their way into the legislation?
Probably not, and I'll tell you why. And look, I mean, they have their philosophical viewpoints, we have ours. I believe fundamentally that the HOPE scholarship is about merit. Which students deserve this scholarship based on what they've done in the classroom, not based on their parents, not based on their parents' earning, not based on what particular school they went to. What are kids doing in the classroom? Are they learning? Are they putting forth the effort to be those top students? And if they are, they ought to be rewarded. And we ought not exclude anybody based on how much money their parents make. We ought not exclude somebody based on what high school they go to. So if we're going to make this thing or continue to have the HOPE scholarship and the Zell Miller scholarship as truly merit-based, we need to make sure that it's merit-based. And maybe the Senate Democrats disagree with that, but I think it has been a very successful model because it's based on merit, and we need to keep it that way.
We now have the recommendations of the Tax Council, and they're in the form of a House bill right now. So I'm wondering if you had a chance to look at that legislation and kind of give us some feedback on what your thoughts are on those tax proposals.
Well, the good thing is I think that that the Tax Council, bipartisan, well, not even a partisan, it was a nonpartisan, really, group of experts that looked at this, recognized that Georgia needs to move away from the income tax model and towards the consumption tax model. And this moves us in that direction. At the federal level, people would call that the fair tax. And here in Georgia, I don't think we would want to call it a fair tax only because it doesn't get rid of the income tax, but it certainly shifts us in that direction. The positive benefit to that is easier compliance. From the Department of Revenue standpoint, easier to go out and make sure people are collecting taxes properly, because instead of now having 8 million taxpayers, you have just the businesses that are collecting the taxes. It's also, the consumption tax is easier to understand. Everybody knows what a sales tax is. So moving in that direction is a good idea, and I think that those recommendations were helpful. I think that the recommendations on what we do with manufacturing, particularly as it pertains to the sales tax on energy, the current sales tax puts us at a distinct disadvantage to our competitors around us. Getting rid of that is a very good idea, and I think we should. Looking at the premium tax for insurance is a good idea. Of course, what gives people pause are taxes on services, and that's where people have some concern. And I completely understand that. And I think one thing that we need to look at as we're talking about services is really draw a distinction between businesses that collect no sales tax at all right now and other businesses who already collect a sales tax on the goods they sell but aren't collecting it on services. It would certainly be a wise first step, I think, if you're moving in that direction, to look at those businesses that are already collecting a sales tax. They have the mechanisms in place to collect it because they're doing it already. They understand the system. The compliance will probably be a lot higher. I think that would be a first good step before we look at services or taxing services that don't collect sales tax today.
Senator Chip Rogers is the majority leader in the Senate. Thanks so much for joining us here on Primetime Lawmakers.
You bet. Thank you.
That we'll be talking further about that coming up in Primetime Lawmakers. Big changes may be coming in how you pay taxes in Georgia. I'll be talking with Representative Mickey Chanel, sponsor of the tax overhaul bill that's before the General Assembly, and Kelly McCutcheon, president of the Georgia Public Policy Foundation. Stay with us. Welcome back to Primetime Lawmakers. Last month, the Special Counsel of Tax Reform and Fairness released its report and recommendations to revise the state's tax code. The recommendations have been incorporated into a tax overhaul bill that was introduced in the House last week. Now, many specifics have yet to be hammered out, but in general, the bill would raise sales taxes while lowering income taxes. Now, a few specifics: personal services like haircuts, lawn care, and car repairs may be taxed. Also, car sales done person to person, as opposed to through a dealer, might come under the scrutiny of the Georgia Department of Revenue. Joining me now on set to talk about it is Representative Mickey Chanel, sponsor of the bill and chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee. Also, Kelly McCutcheon, president of the Georgia Public Policy Foundation, independent think tank. It's great to have you with us. This is probably, at least in my mind, one of the most important things we'll do now, because this tax system has been around an awful long time. And Representative Chanel, let's start with you. I guess the first job for you and your colleagues is to hammer this whole proposal into language the General Assembly can consider. Is that the bottom line?
It is. I think a little background was probably appropriate. Last year, the General Assembly and a lot of other people recognized that we have a structural problem in our tax system. It has not been updated in decades, quite frankly, and the basic problem is that while Georgia continues to grow, it's one of the fastest growing states in the country, our tax revenue has not followed that population growth. During this past 10 years, the state of Georgia gained about 1.5 million people, but our overall state tax revenue stayed about level. So we have a structural problem, and in recognition of that, the General Assembly named a special counsel of independent folks to look at the thing and bring recommendations to us as a General Assembly, and that's what they have done. The recommendations are complicated, and there's a lot of them, and we're trying to get our arms around all those things at the General Assembly level.
And before I get to Kelly on some breaking news here about what this thing would actually mean, scoring it, the job one for this special committee is to put all the recommendations on the table so the General Assembly can consider the whole thing as a package. Is that right?
Well, what the legislation called for that created both the tax council as well as the special joint committee is that we had to put all of those recommendations in one bill as they were. We've done that, and that's what's been introduced so far. Having said that, that obviously is not what's going to pass, and in terms of all of the details in there, we are now trying to figure out and take what they've done as a template and figure out what will best work for Georgians.
In the end, one of the biggest questions is what tax reform would do. And Kelly McCutcheon, your group is maybe run some numbers that we now know. What?
Well, that's right, not our group, but Georgia's economy is in the doldrums. And I think everyone understands that. Just today, we announced the highest unemployment in Georgia's history. Over the last 10 years, personal income growth in Georgia has been next to last in the entire country. We need something to get our economy going again, and tax reform is the way to do it. Reducing income tax rates is what every tax expert, what Ronald Reagan did, even Alice Rivlin, who was in Atlanta this week with the Concord Coalition, who's President Clinton's budget director, she says the key to economic growth is reducing income tax rates. The problem, when the Tax Council issued its final report, not all the numbers were in. So that's why a lot of people thought it was a tax cut. So the Tax Council came back in, number one, and voted unanimously to say this is clearly not a tax increase. This is supposed to be revenue neutral. Mm-hmm. Number two, last week, Georgia State University finished scoring the bill. What it shows, we do not need to phase in income tax rates over time. It shows that we can go from 6% down to 4%, both the corporate and the personal income tax rate immediately. And we have $348 million left over.
And the reason we can do that is these other ways that we might be able to pick up revenue, collecting sales tax that's been left on the table makes up for that?
And broadening the base of the income tax, getting rid of some of the exemptions and deductions, going to a flat rate. It brings in much more revenue and it gives you enough money to go in and give tax credits to those on the lower income scale to protect them from being impacted. But it allows us to lower the rates for everyone.
Representative Chanel, what do you see as the goal, the overall goal of the whole reform effort here? Stability, fairness, what is it?
I think bring fairness to the system, transparency, and predictability. Again, as people move into this state, we need to be sure that we're taxing things that people use, because the more people that come in, the more people we have in schools, the more state patrol we have, all of these kind of things. And I think predictability and fairness for all Georgians is the primary thing we're trying to accomplish.
What happens if the whole package is voted down? You said a moment ago that it'll have to be presented that way, right? What happens next in the process?
Well, no, what the legislation called for is for all of their recommendations to be put in one bill and to be introduced.
Okay.
Not passed, introduced.
Okay.
And so what we will do is deal with it with what we call a committee substitute. We will take that as the vehicle, and then when the General Assembly comes together and forms a consensus on what should be in the bill, then we'll substitute that bill for the other one.
So this is like a big piece of marble, and the General Assembly is going to sculpt it now.
That is correct.
Okay. And that's a very important point, Scott, because people have been already looking at the tax reform plan, and they've been complaining about things that are very unlikely to be included in this bill. Exactly. I mean,
like
the
what?
Premium tax, the changes in the fuel tax. We spent the last 2 or 3 years putting together a transportation sales tax. I don't think they're going to change the way we tax fuel anytime soon. They're not going to be taxing a lot of healthcare items, nonprofits, a lot of the things that you hear. I mean, I think there are going to be some substantive changes to this bill, and it's going to make it better, and it's going to make it easier. I mean, the Tax Council did a great job. Economically and academically, absolutely the right thing to do. But as Representative Chanel knows, you've got to pass and get enough votes to pass. So politics come into play, and there's some changes. That's where the $248 million come into play.
Did taking away the sales tax on food destabilize our revenue system, and do you see that coming back?
Well, it absolutely did. I mean, all the research shows that the tax on groceries definitely is a stabilizing factor, and it helps grow your revenues for a long time, gets to that structural deficit you've been talking about. You know, why should we give wealthy individuals, middle-income individuals a tax break and make it harder for grocers to determine what is groceries and what are not, when we can provide tax credits and prevent low-income individuals from being impacted? It allows us to reduce income tax rates even more. So it's not inherently bad. How you do it is very important. We don't want to hurt low-income individuals.
Do you see that staying in, Representative Chanel?
That's certainly a recommendation of the council. Whether or not I see it staying in there will be a process of it going through the legislative process.
We don't believe that's a deal killer. If it's not in there, that means you just have to give in other areas.
Where's to make it work? Now, there is a proposal to eliminate the retirement income tax exemption. The economic effect on senior citizens. This is one of Governor Perdue's big accomplishments, letting senior citizens get a tax exemption for income that's not wages. Now, does that go away? What do you think?
That's what the tax council recommended, and I want to be clear about what that is currently. Okay. It's $35,000 per person, which is $70,000 obviously for a couple. Plus, you factor in the Social Security exemption, it's over $100,000 for a couple that's retired as far as retirement income. I don't see that going away. Even though the tax council recommended it would, I don't think that's going to happen.
And that's not going to hurt the scoring you talked about a moment ago?
Again, you have to give somewhere else, but there's some room for give a little bit here, give a little bit there, and that's clearly one of those where it's very difficult when you have a tax break, even though it may or may not be the right thing to do, to take something away retroactively. So I think that's going to be very difficult to keep.
It's an integrated approach, and that is the tax council's recommendation contain a whole lot of things, and at the end of the day balances out. We're going to have to do the same thing. It just may not be the exact same items in there. Will not be the exact same items in there.
Did the boys in the back room run some numbers on what would have to happen to get rid of the state income tax totally? Put us on more of an even foot with Florida and Tennessee on attracting
I'm
folks?
sure that would be a goal, and I think it's very important for us to compete with Texas, Florida, and Tennessee, and we'd love to get there. But what that means is you're going to have to expand tax on a lot of services and goods, and you see how very difficult that is. Or you have to increase the sales tax rate very high, just like Tennessee has, if you add them all up, they're at 9 or 10%. And, right now there wasn't the political will to do that. What we see is the incremental approach. Let's get that rate down to 4%. What's not being factored in these numbers is economic growth. We believe there's a supply side impact. We think there's going to be a lot more growth. Small businesses are going to benefit from this, and they create jobs and revenue. So we believe we'll be able to get to 3% in a very short amount of time, in 2 or 3 years. Then you're at a point where you might be able to say, what's it going to take for us to go and get rid of the other 3%?
It's a step in the right direction.
And so the sales tax rate would stay the same. Let's underscore that.
4, 4, and 4 is the recommendation. It'd be very simple: 4% sales tax rate, 4% corporate tax rate, 4% individual income tax rate.
Okay. Where does it happen next? We've heard some conflicting views on how fast this thing may go. What do you think?
We're trying to go as fast as we can. I will say that I'm not particularly optimistic we're going to be able to finish the job during this session. I would hope that we can. But it's a massive undertaking. We got the report the first week of the session. We've been dealing with this matter and at the same time doing what we have to do normally in the General Assembly session. It's possible, but we'll just have to see.
And underlining one more thing, Kelly, the scoring coming back, reducing the state income tax from 6 to 4% would leave us with what kind of surplus if the give and take is allowed to remain?
About $248 million. Now, and this is a big deal, Scott. The Wall Street Journal has already run 2 lead editorials on Georgia's tax plan before the bill was even dropped. This is very big. I think other states are going to be chasing after us if we can do this. We think it's critical to Georgia's future.
We'll watch it happen. Thanks for your thoughts, and thanks for your service on this. We'll be watching. Thanks a lot. Appreciate you being here. And coming up tomorrow on Primetime Lawmakers, a bill that allows parole of children convicted of certain felonies will be considered by the Senate Judiciary Committee. It's the end of another legislative week, so we'll check in with Tom Crawford of the Georgia Report for his take on what's been happening under the Gold Dome. We'll bring you another installment in our leadership interview series, plus in-depth analysis on important legislative issues and the latest Capitol news. That's tomorrow night right here at 7. You can see a repeat of this broadcast tomorrow morning at 5:30 on GPB. Coming up next, Rhett Turner's documentary, Chattahoochee, From Water War to Water Vision. Stay tuned. That's our broadcast for the 23rd legislative day of the 2011 session. Thanks to our guests for joining us. For Wandy Lawson and the whole Primetime Lawmakers team, I'm Scott Slade. We hope you have a great night.
This is a GPB original production.